Alberto, may I speak even though we're recording? We just all met in London last week because there's a new book out of Dalibor's writings,
Oh, that's nice.
edited by Alexandra Stara with Peter Carl, and it looks like it's very, very interesting. So you might be interested in looking at that. It's a Routledge publication.
Yes, 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 yes.
Lot of work went into.
Who published it, Dagmar?
I beg your pardon?
Who published it?
Routledge. It's called The Latent World of Architecture, and it brings together some of his.
I'm sorry, you froze some of his previous essays, right?
Well, there's a number that haven't been published, including one called The Relation Between Religion and Science, which is really interesting. It explores issues of ecology as well. So yeah, there's some previously published ones, but others that are new. First of all, I'm just to say I'm actually introducing the session this evening instead of Jose de Paiva, who's unfortunately got problems with his voice, so he's actually asked me to deputize to this evening. First of all, welcome to everyone, and this evening is the last of an online talks chaired by Eric Parry Architects, and the speaker this evening is Biba Dow of Dow Jones Architects. This will be the last seminar before Christmas and belongs to the series on sacred space entitled Presence, Person and Beauty. Biba will be talking to us about a title, Quiet Marvels, which is actually reference to Seamus Heaney. So I'm interested to hear the reference to Seamus Heaney's work in the projects. The projects discussed will include the Bevis Marks Synagogue, Maggie's Cardiff, Christchurch Spitalfields, and Leach Pottery, I should say. Just to give you a bit of background to the series, Presence, Person, Beauty is a series of seminars we've been running, or rather Eric has been running, and explores the intersections between theological ideas and architecture, both from a historical and contemporary perspective. The series is convened in collaboration with Eric's practice and the Reverend Canon Peter Newby of St Mary's University, as well as in his role as a PhD student at London Metropolitan School of Architecture, at London Metropolitan University School of Architecture, Art, Architecture and Design. The series, Presence, Person, Beauty, runs alongside our sister series convened in collaboration between Eric Parry Architects and Cube, the Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies at London Metropolitan University School of Art, Architecture and Design. And that series is entitled The Living Memory of Cities. And the first of our seminars in 2023 is scheduled for 17th of January, where our speaker will be Robert Taverner. So just keep that noted in your diaries. Now, before I start, just to sort of say, before Biba starts, the order of the seminar normally is it's an informal gathering. I've obviously will give a little bit more background to Biba as an architect, and then Eric will give a kind of personal introduction or personal welcome. Then Biba will actually do her presentation, and then immediately after that there'll be questions. And the questions basically, it's open to the floor. Anybody who wants to ask questions and explore some of the themes around the topic, the subject that Biba is going to be presenting, the context of the projects. Just to give a bit of background to Biba, she's an architect practicing in London, obviously in her firm. She studied architecture at the University of Cambridge, and she co-founded Dow Jones Architects with Alan Jones in 2000. The practice, which is very well-known practice in London, has received many awards, is interested in urban generosity, cultural connections and material richness. The work has won multiple awards, and Biba was shortlisted actually for the Architecture of the Year in 2018 Women in Architecture Awards. Recent projects include the Garden Museum, Maggie's Cardiff, Peter von Kant Gallery and St Mary Magdalene in Paddington. Biba lectures and writes on the work of her practice and wider cultural ideas, has been involved with teaching and examining throughout her career. She's a regular awards assessor and sits on the Cathedral Fabric Committee at Coventry Cathedral, as well as on several design review panels. So Eric, do you want to say a couple of words?
I'm more than willing, just to say that my knowledge of Biber and then subsequently Dow Jones starts in Cambridge with Biber as a student, a very gifted student, very sensitive student, and moving forward over the time between then and now, which is amounts to something like 30 years, I've watched and been able to enjoy Dow Jones' work, and Biber has been kind enough to give me personal tours of several of those projects that were mentioned. So I hold the practice in the highest regard, and and wish it and every success moving forward. And I'm delighted to hear these her thoughts and insights tonight. So over to Biber.
Just before we start, I just should let everybody know that the seminar is being recorded and may be available to view later. If you do not wish to be recorded, please turn off your camera. Just to kind of highlight something there. Okay, Biber, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, both of you, for such a lovely welcome. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so sorry about that, everyone. So the title is a reference to a poem called Lightning's 8 by Seamus Heaney, which is a poem, a very vivid description of an event about time and experience in a religious setting. And I wanted to include it as a kind of lodestone because he is a poet that and a writer that I go back to again and again for his description of the phenomenal world, for talking about memory and place in a way which feels to me very, very potent and akin to how we think about architecture and designing and cities and spaces. And so in terms of how spaces are understood and materials are felt and experiences are shared and reenacted, his writing again and again grounds our experience of human life in a physical world which is brought alive by memory. So what, in terms of how that relates to what we do, so I'm now struggling to change slides. Okay, sorry. In terms of how that relates to what we do, I think the things that we are most interested in are how material has an iconographic meaning, but it also has a kind of texture that kind of roots you in an ability to make connections to places. And also we think a lot about spatial sequences, a kind of muteness of architecture through choice of material that is joined with a sort of depth of spatial experience, so that those two things work alongside each other. We always try and choose materials very carefully, but to limit a palette so that there is a kind of amplification of the use of a material. And that then that kind of lends a kind of reading of a place to a building, and that buildings and spaces should be as open and as permeable as possible, so that they encourage participation and access in its broadest sense of openness to people and situations. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects. They're not quite the ones that were described earlier, actually, because I thought that 4 was too many. So I'm going to talk about a project we did at a church in London called St. Mary Magdalene, our project for Maggie's Cancer Care in Cardiff, and a project, so both of those are completed, and also a project that we're working on at the moment for the Leach Pottery in St Ives. And the image on the screen is of, it's a photograph of the Festival of the Palio in Siena. And what I think is extraordinary is the sort of transformation of a place of every day coming together for the very specific time and setting of a festival, and how spaces, in particular public spaces, need to accommodate that flexibility and to hold both of those points in one place. The church that we finished at and worked on and extended in Paddington is a listed church, Grade 1 listed church by George Edmund Street, that was built in the 1870s. This is an image of it at the time. In fact, we then added our little extension to it at the west end of the church, but it describes very vividly the setting for which the church was designed originally. And it was surrounded by workers' houses for people who were living in multi-tenancy buildings. A lot of them were Irish bricklayers who were working on the construction of the canal and the railway at Paddington. And the church was part of a kind of social and religious framework for wider social care. So it included things like schools and orphanages and 2 churches, amongst other things. And when we started working with them, it was quite desolate. It had a very, very small congregation of about 25 people. So in terms of the management of the building, there were quite a lot of issues of just simply being able to afford to do the necessary upkeep. I think what's interesting is that it's such a very skillfully designed building, but the context within which it sits has changed radically since when it was designed. It used to be in a very, very tight urban setting, and so the tower was the element that stood above that, and it's the more decorated element of the exterior. It was the last site to be filled in a very dense grid, and it accommodates a very substantial change in level across the site, and it has a kind of prow at this end, so it was squeezed into the available space. On the inside, it's the height's been exaggerated by making a blind aisle on one side, this north aisle that we can see here, so that the height, it gives more height to the central height of the nave, the central space of the nave. So it's a place of exaggeration. It has a really interesting approach to material and decoration. So there's a lot of exposed brickwork internally and stonework, which is very similar to the exterior. But then internally, there's a lot of additional decoration. So carved stations of the cross, which are very, very rare, statuary, a painted ceiling that when we started working on the building, we were very, we weren't aware of the detail of it at all because it was in such poor condition. Glazed tiles that are alternately plain colour and reflective, so that it moves. There's a kind of striation as you walk past. Very elaborate stained glass, and also many shortcomings. So it had, when we started working on it, there were no WCs, there was no electric light downstairs, there was no running water. There are 5 doors to the building, and they all had to change in level. So our brief was to open it up. There was a quite unique coming together of a client made up of 2 bodies: the Church of England, represented through the parish council and the vicar, and a local development trust who'd been working for 25, 30 years in the area on employment and social inclusion projects. And they took advantage of a new pastoral measure which has allowed Anglican churches to have lay or secular tenants within the building. So uniquely, it combines worship with wider community access. And I think one of the interesting things to consider is that part of the decline in the congregation reflects the urban change that took place. So the clearance of the buildings that we saw in that first image took place after the Second World War as part of a massive slum clearance project, and a number of very different density new buildings were built. And I think as a result of that, there was the beginning of a dislocation from people who had lived there for a very long time to an increasingly diverse local community. But I think what's interesting is that there were a lot of similarities still. We looked at the Booth poverty map that was drawn at the time that the church was built, and the indications are that it was a very, very poor neighbourhood. When we started working with the project, I think it was 14th in the whole country, the 14th ward for the highest level of child poverty in the whole country. So although it's in an area that is 10 minutes walk from Maida Vale, and you might think that it was an incredibly affluent bit of London, in fact, because its geography of disconnection through the canal and the railway, it's actually this remainder pocket of London that has a lot of social inequality. And the objective of the project was to make this very beautiful church open to a wider audience. So our site was to make a little building in this tiny gap that's 2.5 meters wide at its narrowest side on the south side. It's about 9 meters wide on the north side, and to make connections, that means both into the church across its extraordinary change in level. So there's a 6-meter change in level this way, as well as connecting into the undercroft of the church, which was unused really, and the church itself, and also making broader social connections. So we made a little building that's inserted and opens into a basement level into this wonderful undercroft space, and then opens at the canal level on the north side into what is now a park with a cafe. And then has an education room at the upper floor. It's in many ways it's a tiny building, but it has many challenges on each of the levels that it's connecting. And it also opens into the primary school playground as a way of directly encouraging use of the building from east to west. So we wanted to make a building that remembered it remembered the qualities of being a found space trapped between the school and the west end of the building. So there's a double height entrance space that connects to a stair that is roof lit, that does the orientation and connection to the canal level cafe and the education room above, and then a small meeting room. There are WCs and there are kitchens. So it's doing the sort of regular accessible stuff. I think for us, what was always more interesting was how to extend a church in a way that would be inviting to different people. And that was a core part of the brief, and something that, in terms of working in a highly listed building, always raises questions about, why are you making something that is obvious or speaks a different language to the building that is there? One of the things we did was to look at photographs, and in fact the church appears in a 1950s police film, so we looked at that a lot, and we reconstructed the original setting of the church in which Street designed it as a way of talking about difference. So it was clear that Street was designing a building that was very, very different to the setting that he made it for. It was this place of heightened sensory awareness, of heightened drama through the way it responds to the site, with shifts and emphasis on corners, a very clear approach to materiality that sets up a kind of ground condition in which he then makes points of very particular decoration. And all of those are about orienting people around a building. And what we found useful in making these drawings was to then say that we were making a building that referred back to that original setting. It allowed us to make a trabeated building that tried to restore some of the intensity of that original setting, lost to the current situation of the church in order to put back intensity and difference. So these were a series of models we made as we worked through ideas for developing what the building looked like. And we were interested in something that was very open and like a loggia to the canal side park, but that had these heightened elements, these little lanterns that were gave us the ability to mark corners and define edges. So, for instance, you can see that in this very, the narrow 2.5 metre wide bit of the building, if we hadn't had some kind of lantern element, the building would have been invisible. And the whole point was to be able to say there are things happening in here and come on in. So we wanted something that would act like a little beacon of activity within the street. We were also really interested in making a response to streets' material language of this very cohesive brick skin with stone dressing, Portland stone dressing around windows and string courses and bandings and buttressing. And so, but rather than making a brick building, we wanted to make something that had brought to the outside some of the kind of decorative qualities of the interior. So it's a faience building with precast concrete elements that are very sharp, that have a high mica content. So there's a kind of little sparkle quality to them, and that they then set up a counterpoint to the brick buildings that to either side of it. The lanterns are used to draw attention to particular moments in the context of the new building. So looking back towards the spire, and then forming this corner so that brings light and drama into the education room, which sits amongst the trees. And then the 4-storey element of the elevation that sits down in the school playground. So this is the education room, which is used for all kinds of community activities. We also were able to reopen a bricked up porch into the church itself that had been the main processional entrance into the church. The idea was that you would enter in off what were the dark streets and then arrive at the West End. So you would go down and then arrive at the West End and be met with the sort of drama of the interior of the church. And this had always been, we found evidence that it had been bricked off from a very, and gated from a very early stage into the building's life. And so we made a new porch that allowed us to provide a managed entrance into the building and has now reactivated this important processional entrance. Sorry, just waiting for. Okay, so we also worked with Clifton Conservation and Carew Architecture to restore the interior of the church. There was an amazing decorative scheme that was revealed, and the church is now very busily used for all kinds of events, which is very satisfying. And I think one of the really interesting things for us was the idea of bringing into the city the open space of the Undercroft that was unused. So this is Rut Blaise Luxemburg's photograph, one of her London Underground series, and the idea that there is a kind of latent world below the ground that did not form part of the public experience, that this project has brought back into activity. So our stair connects down we made new openings at the west end of the church. We made these with giant precast concrete lintels that then open through new openings through a small foyer and bar area into the Undercroft. And one of the really interesting things about this project was realizing that the way that this space had been made. So this is these are the kind of retaining walls made by the railway bricklayers, which are just fantastic sculptural objects. And the vaulting had been made by casting, these are in situ concrete vaults that were made by being cast onto brick dust. So this is an integral pink dyeing to the undercroft. And I think because of that, we were interested in making the shell of the new building out of concrete. I mean, to be honest, I think that would be something we would revisit now that we think about the use of concrete very differently and its environmental impacts. But at the time, there seemed to be a very strong material connection to the church, that we would be drawing out this material and making a concrete building like an expression of the undercroft that then is clad in the glazed tiles. And it gave us an opportunity to also have an artist-led project with local people, where we were exploring, this is the formwork drawing for the stairs, where we were exploring the history of the building. We used that as a timeline for the stair. We made tiles with local people as part of our interior colour scheme. So that there were many ways that we were trying to draw in a local audience and to draw council from their involvement. And then we also thought about the tiles of the church floor itself as a way of thinking about the design of the terracotta. So this is a drawing we made of the nave floor that shows the kind of very decorated tapestry of different patterns. What we were really interested in was that there are just 3 colours of tile, red and black and white, and squares and triangles that are used in this very vivid way. And we adapted those motifs of the floor on a giant scale as a way of drawing together the 5 very disparate elements, fragmented elements of the facade of the new little building, and draw them together with a kind of textured bas-relief frieze that connects them and provides a kind of visual continuity across all of them. So these are 25mm relief tiles, which are then a reference to the character of the interior of the building. So the next project I wanted to talk about is about connecting to place in terms of how we think about topography. And this is a drawing by Elizabeth Vellacott, who was an English artist working in Cambridgeshire for all of her life. And it's of the Black Mountains in Wales, near to where we worked with Maggie's Cancer Care for their building there at Velindre Hospital. And what I think is interesting is much of her work is about domesticity, and she's talked about the brittle nature, the very fragile nature of what home is. For Maggie's Cancer Care, their brief is to design a home from home, and a home from home that is as special as possible to support people when they feel at their most vulnerable. And our site was the hospital in the north of Cardiff, on the edge of the South Downs valleys. And we were thinking about how it's a hospital that it's a dedicated cancer hospital that serves not just the residents of Cardiff, but all of South East Wales. So people coming from quite wide, far-flung rural communities where the industrialisation of the landscape has such a strong presence on the towns and places where people live. And also the colour of the hills. So this is the Bracken, this is by James Morris, one of his series of valleys, villages. The Bracken is such a kind of strong characteristic of the local topography. This is our site, in fact, for the hospital. So I think what was really interesting when we first saw the plan of the hospital is I'd imagined this would be like a 4, 5, 6-story building. In fact, it's largely single story, and it's just been extended laterally, leaving a car park that you drive around in a one-way system and try and find somewhere. We were allowed to choose our site for the day centre. And we were drawn to a band of landscaping, in fact, of a neighbouring site of a disused listed hospital to the north of the site, which brings the only greenery at all to the whole hospital site. And so we wanted to take advantage of that and to kind of borrow that landscaping as a way of locating our building. What we were interested in was making connections to the form of the topography, but also to the sort of provisional character of building and the use of corrugated metal for farm buildings. Sorry, every now and then it just stops moving as a slide. But also for the industrial buildings. And so we wanted to make something that had that kind of roughness, but familiarity, and put it together in a way that brought a kind of new crispness to it. So we had a triangular site. This is a little concept model we made early on. The idea would be that there would be a kind of excavated courtyard as a threshold from the car park into which you arrive and pass through, and then the building would open up on this side to the trees beyond. And we oriented our timber joist structure at 45 degrees to the site, so that we made an irregularity around it where the geometry of the site and the geometry of the roof meet to make a kind of new landscape of corrugated metal into which the different spaces of the brief are found. So as an idea, there's an orientation to landscape as a threshold when you come in, and then you enter, you're oriented towards a painting that was made for the building by Ossie Rees-Osmond of the kind of psychodrama of his own Orange Mountain. And then it opens up with a big view along the glazed side to the trees of the neighbouring buildings. We worked with Cleve West, who is a most marvellous landscape designer who talks a lot about allotment growing and life cycles, and was very interested in making a kind of quiet place of contemplation as a garden. So this is not about a sort of very manicured space, but something that allows quiet change within it. So he did a lot of underplanting and clearing in the neighbouring trees, so that there were kind of a sort of quiet seasonal change, and he left the arisings from all of the clippings as animal homes, so that there's a kind of quiet idea about renewal and regeneration. Those were his drawings, actually. So our plan works with the idea of arriving through the courtyard, so passing from the car park through the courtyard into a space where you will have passed by the office of Maggie's staff, and you find yourself in the main kitchen area. Maggie's philosophy is that making a cup of tea is an icebreaker, and so the first thing you want to be able to see is that you know how to find yourself a mug and make a cup of tea in that most familiar of gestures. In fact, an artist made us the mugs as a handling collection, so that you have something nice in your hands as soon as you walk through the door. Around that are the other spaces of the centre, so different meeting rooms and a large meeting room for counselling and exercise classes and art therapy, and then spaces where you can tuck yourself away and have quiet conversations or just sit on your own. And in the centre, a small space where you can be a bit more private. And the way we designed these was thinking about the formation of these rooms as pieces of timber joinery that are like giant furniture that form the shapes of the spaces of the room under the landscape of the roof. So looking at how Morandi pulls together different vessels, the idea that the space in between them is the landscape of the building, and inside are these joinery pieces that define the different areas. And one of them in particular, there's a Welsh word which is a cwtch, which means it's the kind of the space where you go and hide when you're little. It's the kind of little cupboard under the stairs, and it also has a second meaning, which is an embrace. So the idea that it's a space where you are safe. So we wanted to make the little room at the heart of Maggie's building into a kind of a space that feels like an enclosure. We also looked at, there's a fabulous part of the National Museum of Wales is a collection of historic buildings outside Cardiff at a site called St Fagans, and one of them is a 17th century farmhouse with this chimney that you can get inside. This is a picture inside it, with a funnel of light at the top. We were interested in the cwtch being the element that is a funnel of light that holds you. That's the only thing that pierces through the topography of the roof at the centre of the building. Thinking about, in terms of materials, so it was a Maggie Centre that had a kind of it's kind of long story, but because the museum has its own development plans, this Maggie's was designed to be to work on a smaller site for a smaller budget in order to kickstart the process of establishing Maggie's in Velindre. And so we wanted to use materials that had some of that sort of pragmatic qualities that could be elevated through the care in which they're put together. So we were looking at Donald Judd's use of Douglas fir plywood as a way of thinking about how we make those joinery elements within our building. So inside the cwtch, this is Douglas fir triboard with a little shutter. We worked also with a fantastic curator, Mike Tooby, who organised a loan of pictures from the National Museum, so works including Mally Morris and Sean Edwards and many others, as a way of bringing that collection into everyday experience. I know this is a public building, anyone can walk into it. We also commissioned specific things, so we worked with Linda Florence, who made these tiles for the fireplace at the back of the building. And Anthony Gormley very kindly gave us another set of bollards, which we needed. We needed some kind of protection for the building because it literally is surrounded by parked cars. In terms of how the building is made, we were remaking the capping pieces to make as crisp a profile as possible, but essentially it's a very pragmatic weathering steel cladding material. We spent our money, as it were, on the joinery. So the windows are pulled out as boxes and again clad in weathering steel as a protective frame around them that gives them a kind of sharp edge. And then inside the joinery pieces meet the landscape of the roof and exaggerate the difference in geometry of them. And spaces to the meeting rooms were designed to kind of be as adaptable as possible. So you could leave a door open, or you could shut a door, or you could close the curtains. So there are kind of degrees of open and closeness within the building. And then the last building I wanted to talk about is the project we're designing at the moment for the Leach Pottery in St Ives. So again, it's an industrial landscape. It's about firing clay. This is in fact from a different place. It's a photograph of the copper smelting for protecting the nets at Dungeness. But what we've always loved about this place is the idea that an industrial process through the use of clay is making a ground and making a place for human activity within a landscape. At St Ives, it was an industrial landscape from at least Roman times, with mining and then with fishing, becoming an artist colony in the 1880s, and then probably most famously during the Second World War as an exile for artists across the world who were finding seclusion and safety there. Bernard Leach had grown up in Hong Kong and worked in Japan as a pioneering artist craftsman, looking for a way of making pottery that was a reaction, a bit like Morris, to industrialized processes. And he was very interested in finding ways of bringing out the sort of essential qualities of pottery. So thinking about the form of pottery and its relationship to clay, thinking about glazes as melted stone qualities. So he had ideas about ethical pottery and its connections to place. He came to St. Ives in the 1920s, and he came with his Japanese colleague Shoji Hamada, and they set up what was to become the kind of place of renewal of clay craft pottery in Britain. They founded the pottery in the north of the town on the banks of a stream that they could use for the process, and built this is Bernard Leach's own model of the pottery that pottery studio he built. It was built in a very, very pragmatic way. I think one of the really interesting elements of it are the climbing kilns, where this is a technique he introduced from Japan, where a fire is lit at one end and then climbs through the different chambers, and each of them has a different temperature of fire in it. This is what it looks like today. So in 2009, it had a number of extensions, which in many ways, I think, present some problems in terms of how the building is understood, because it kind of separates the cottage where he lived and the studio. What we're looking at doing is trying to make those a bit more open, as well as to build a new building that provides more space for the pottery to operate. So I think what's interesting is, at the moment, if you visit the site, there's a shop all along this building here, which again was added in 2009, is the working pottery itself. And then this is the museum element. These are the climbing kilns of Bernard Leach. There are aspects like the clay drops, where clay was dropped over the wall. This is the stream running along the side. But there is a bit of a sense of disconnection of what happened. And I think what we've been trying to do in our project is to reconnect the process back to the landscape of St. Ives and its surroundings. And I think what's really interesting is looking at that. So this is one of Ben Nicholson's paintings of St. Ives, is a connection between landscape and building, and in fact of pottery, that is very much about the work at the pottery. This is Lubena Himid's work when she was a resident at Porthmeor Studios in St. Ives. And again, seeing the formal connection between the town and the sea and the topography is really extraordinary. Stannach mine, so this is it in its heyday in the late 19th century, where it was mining tin and copper and zinc and arsenic. And this is St. Ives mine. So this was very, very close to the pottery site. It was very much a place of industry when the artists started working there. And we've been looking at the sort of spaces that they then colonised. So Porthmeor Studios, where this is a photograph from, is a former sail loft. And also the influence of the Japanese tradition that Bernard Leach was directly connected to. So this is Katsura Palace in Kyoto, where there is an explicit connection through this threshold area between the landscape and the building, and between the interior and the exterior, and through the use of timber in the construction. So all of these things we wanted to draw on in our making of a building. This is Leach's standardware, which he introduced in the Second World War as part of a government programme about utility, the utilitarian movement, and about kind of everyday objects of necessity. So this is a model of the existing building here. So the cottage and the studio, and then the newer additions of exhibition and archive and pottery studio itself. And our proposed building on the site of a neighbouring cottage built for his son, where we will make the studio spaces for the potters that refer to the north lights of the sail lofts, and spaces for education at this end of the building and the building of the site, and then a timber and glass covered area corridor that, like the connecting corridors across the landscape at Louisiana, find a way of drawing the river and the connection of the water to the pottery process from kiln to studio back into the site. We are thinking about different types of metal cladding that allude to the industrial processes on the site, whether they're metal glazes to tiles or metal tiles themselves. Thinking about rooflit spaces for people to work in that look out onto the site and make connections onto the site, and then find themselves with a topography that alludes back to the form of the buildings in St. Ives and the form of the landscape, held together by the band of the timber corridor connecting the new buildings like a ribbon across the site. Thank you.
Thank you, Biba, for a really inspiring description and passage through those three interrelated buildings. And yeah, absolutely. So, you know, first and foremost, and maybe we could start with some questions, please.
Thank you, Biba. I thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. I've got a question, well, one really kind of interesting question about the legacy of the industrial landscape in your two latter projects, the Maggie Centre in the Welsh landscape, and of course the St. Ives Pottery Centre, because it seems that the idea of industrial materials, how you respond to them in terms of what I could kind of describe not as a sort of celebration necessarily of the industrial legacy, but something that you translate and transform into these spaces of making and contemplation, the Maggie Centre and the Pottery Works. And I'm just interested in how you make of this question of the legacy of industry in the English and Welsh landscape, and how we deal with it, I guess, from a kind of ecological perspective. There are some kind of ecologists who would kind of turn their back on or resist the idea of even acknowledging the legacy of industry in the landscape. But I think in your case, what you're doing is you're utilizing it, but you're translating it, you're transforming it, bringing it back into the landscape and opening the buildings up into a really rich way, and actually almost letting the natural landscape enter into the interior of the buildings. So I'm just kind of interested in how you see that working in your own projects.
Well, I think that there is, they're very different types of landscape. I mean, the Cornish West Penwith is, in a way, it's very much a recovered landscape, and its industry now is fishing industry that has its own challenges, and the impact of industry in West Penwith is, in a way, is much more about a kind of historic legacy of how we understand it as a working place. You're right, there are ethical questions about the role of industry, and one of the questions is about that Cornwall is facing is about whether to reopen a mine in Camborne, which has lithium, which is potentially a massive source of local employment, and you know, could be a very, very important investment for the area. I think in South Wales, well, in fact, both areas suffer to an extent from post-industrial decline. Obviously, Cornwall relies a huge amount on tourism, and that is something that the South Wales valleys are not so well known for. And I think that there, the impact of industrial decline in the 70s and 80s is much more profound, but it's much more recent, and really shapes the character of the valley's towns. I think what we were interested in was there at Maggie's was making a connection to something very, very familiar, what would be very, very familiar to a lot of people who use the buildings, but trying to make it, trying to bring out different qualities by using it in a different way.
I think you are muted. Eric, I think you are muted.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, Alberto. I'm saying how good it is to see you, and wondered whether we could
yeah, okay, sorry, yeah.
interject with a question. So thank you for reminding me that very poignant point. Yeah, but yes, as you're thinking about that, Matthew has raised a hand. So let's ask Matthew to pitch in, please.
Yeah, thanks, Beaver. That was great. I just I made a note when you started about this. You captured in a kind of a little précis at the beginning, a kind of in a nutshell, your outlook by referring to Seamus Heaney, and you talked about engaging with the phenomenal world in a way that resonates with your concern to address how experiences are reenacted. You used this phrase, how experiences are reenacted and shared. And then you talked about these experiences being grounded in a physical world that is brought alive through memory. And it just strikes me that these different projects address this intention in different and very interesting ways. You talked about landscape, about material, and about that sense of memory and maybe resonance between the landscape and the form of the building, and so on. And I was wondering in particular, a sort of a theme of articulation that we saw in all the buildings in different ways, especially with some of the corners, or some of the kind of play between elevation and plan. And I mean, it was especially vivid in the tile work in St. Mary's, but that aspect of articulation, especially with regard to this element of memory, is your intention there to create a legibility for the buildings, or to create a sort of a sense of playfulness? It seems to me that like it's not a very didactic set of intentions, but it does, especially some of the flipping between inside and outside, it seems to make the building speak more in a manner that refers to this kind of phenomenological understanding, if you like, of what design can do. So it's a sort of open question.
So I think perhaps, thinking about the question of corners, I think perhaps that is to do with form and how a building sits in a site. And while there are questions of memory and connection in form, for instance, through, say, the north lights of a sail loft that was then used as an artist studio, that brings together those industries and that craft tradition as a kind of vehicle for making a space for potters to work now in that place. I think it's also a way, there's a sort of that there is also the sort of spatial experience of being on the ground and moving through the building inside or out, and how it relates to its physical context that has a powerful hand in generating form. So I think, whether or not a corner, where it appears and why, I think it's as much to do with its physical context as it's one of memory, perhaps. We make a lot of models of different scales, and we spend a lot of time looking at form and exploring form as a way of thinking about how buildings are made up of kind of groups of forms and groups of spaces and that kind of thing. But I think perhaps the sort of phenomenal experience is perhaps more to do with use and more to do with material, that, something that you touch, that you remember, something that you, you put your hand on that feels like something else, a space that you walk through, or a building that connects you to something else that invites you to engage in an experience. I think for us, those are the particularly more resonant and phenomenal experiences, or places of experience.
Dagmar, please.
You're muted,
Yes, I've got that. Thank you for the talk. Those three buildings are interesting and work very interestingly together. I wanted you to elaborate on something that you said early in the talk. You said you were trying with the church to invite different kinds of people into the building, and this is something that a lot of Victorian and Edwardian institutions are now trying to do, to reinvent themselves in a way that would get young people, all sorts of people coming in through the doors. Churches are one example, theatres are another. One can think, for example, of the National Theatre, which in the 70s wanted, Dennis Laston's building is something very different from those kind of Edwardian classical theatres. So they reached for imagery of geological strata rather than anything to do with classical porticos. And more recently, they built the temporary shed building, which was that red timber shed. And they said that it really did work in attracting completely different types of audiences into the National Theatre. For the time that the shed was up, there was a lot of young people, all sorts of different people, very diverse groups of people coming through the door. So it seems that architecture has this power, the kind of materials and the type of design that you deploy really has the power to bring in different kinds of people. And I wondered, you obviously think about that kind of thing very deeply when you choose the language and the materials and the detailing. Something that is obviously very important to something like the Maggie Center, which seems to be based almost entirely around the idea of providing something which is very different from the normal sort of hospital environment, and people seem to thrive and recover better in an environment which is perhaps a little bit closer to a domestic kind of place. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? How you see the power that architecture has to create an atmosphere, I suppose.
So, well, I think Maggie's they're a very interesting client, because they commission effectively the same brief over and over again. But the way they do it is actually just to define some principles and a kind of more prosaic or kind of repetitive elements are never really represented to you. But they have a very clear philosophy that, when I talked about, the first thing you do is you make a cup of tea, and that's an icebreaker, because you can just say, where do I find a mug, or, that kind of thing, and start talking to the person next to you. Because they're explicitly trying to not be the corridor, the NHS corridor, and the signs and the reception desk. Really, that is where their kind of philosophy stems from. There's an amazing essay by Maggie Keswick about her diagnosis and the physical context for it, and how she dreamt of this sort of alternative space for therapeutic care. And it's also about empowering the individual. So I think it was really, we learned a lot from working with them about thinking about how somebody enters a building or goes somewhere when they're not feeling at their most brave, and is able to orient themselves through a mixture of seeing what's available, seeing what's laid out, kind of having somewhere to pause while you get your bearings, where you're not very conspicuous. Things like, you know, those meeting rooms that have glass screens, and we made those curtains so that you can see if somebody's in there. You don't knock on the door. There isn't a kind of we're busy in here sort of atmosphere. It's, you just infer that there is something more or less private going on in there that you may, you know, you are or you're not part of. So that was a very nuanced experience, I think, for us to kind of understand their ambitions for what a space could be like. St Mary Magdalene, in a way, was the sort of reverse, because that was an existing building, and this was a new counterpart, you know, modest counterpart, but it was also about saying, I am not the same building. You know, I know it's kind of funny compositional challenge that you're not really meant to have two doors next to each other, and yet the new building provides a new door on both sides alongside an existing Victorian door. And how do you choose which door you go in, and what, you know, how do you justify doing that? And I think it was, you know, obviously we were providing level access on both sides, but it was also about sort of demonstrating a sort of permeability and informality, something that on one level, as basic as it doesn't look like a Victorian church, and you might not feel there was anything in there for that building, and you might only discover that actually you can go to a yoga class or just sit and listen to some music or whatever you might want to do in there, because you have come in via a cafe, which, you know, more people feel at ease with. So it was about sort of being able to develop a language that just is an alternative reading of that building, as it were.
Right. So it's interesting the way that churches in many communities, including my neighborhood here in Edinburgh, have become the most important community center, quite apart from religious service. It's part linked to religious service, but a lot of people who go in there are completely secular.
Absolutely.
Yoga and mother and baby classes of different sorts and that kind of thing.
We work a lot with churches, and I think what's really interesting is, you know, that they have sort of ended up in the last 10, 15 years mopping up a lot of social care that isn't being provided elsewhere, you know, and in this year what we're seeing is that they are heated spaces that are public, and that has its own value, very, very important purpose at the moment, and the doors are open, and it's not, you know, increasingly when funding has been reduced from social and public services, that's becoming something that is able to make those connections.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's Alberto, please. Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you, Viva. We've never met, but it was very interesting attending. I don't have the opportunity to attend many of these. I'm usually busy here during noontime, but it was very nice. Yeah, I just have one thing crossed my mind that I was so very shocked on a relatively recent trip to Los Angeles downtown, where we saw a number of cinemas that were now converted to churches, you know, like refurbished as churches for small, I don't know, congregations of something or other. But it's a very fascinating phenomenon, this reuse. And anyhow, I thought I would just bring it up as a fun thing. But I enjoyed very much your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Biba. I want to say that just outside our roles as architects, I mean, just as somebody who would wander into a project of yours like the Garden Museum, it's just a joy to actually be able to and the Leach Pottery, the place. I'm imagining what the project will be. It's an amazing place. There's something about the additive and the sort of sense of the sensitivity to the simultaneity of outside and inside and furniture. That sort of scale that makes one really intrigued, interested, comfortable. That I think is quite phenomenal about these projects and very, very delightful. So, I think I just like to add that I have a sense of great pleasure visiting any of the projects, and thank you so much for sharing them tonight. It was a very fine presentation. Thanks so much on everyone's behalf.
Thank you.
Okay, bye for now. See you soon.